They thought it would be better than prison. A second chance, a shot at redemption. But they were wrong. It wasn't a camp, and it wasn't a unit. It was a death sentence, with a heartbeat.
Loaded onto cold, rusted cattle cars, these men had no idea what awaited them. There would be no artillery support, no backup plans, just one order: advance or die. This was the grim reality of Stalin's penal units, formed not from volunteers or heroes, but from the disgraced, the broken, and the forgotten. Cowards, criminals, dissenters, anyone who had faltered was thrown into these Strafniki formations. And yet, amid the horror, they fought. Not for Stalin, not for the party, but for something far more human: home, family, and a desperate hope that one day they might be forgiven. With rifles in hand and no promise of survival, they stepped into the fire, carrying the unbearable weight of their past and the faintest flicker of a future.
The idea wasn't new. Turning punishment into combat had existed for over a century, but no one would wield it with more cruelty or desperation than Stalin. Across Europe in the 19th century, armies flirted with the concept of penal service. The French Foreign Legion, for example, used harsh drills and brutal punishment to break men down before building them into soldiers. But in the Soviet Union, it was reborn with blood. Leon Trotsky was the first to send penal units to the front during the Russian Civil War. Yet it wasn't until July 1942, after the German invasion had left the Red Army shattered, that Stalin brought the idea back with terrifying force. The city of Rostov had fallen. The Caucasus was wide open, and the Soviet Union was hanging by a thread. Order number 227, not one step back, became Stalin's answer to fear, desertion, and collapse. With it came the rebirth of the Penal Battalions. This time, their mission was clear: redeem your crimes with blood. For every man who hesitated, the message was the same: you either die as a traitor, or you fight like a ghost, invisible, and almost always forgotten. Panic spread faster than bullets. Soldiers fled, officers deserted. The Red Army was crumbling. Stalin had seen enough. On July 28, 1942, a thunderous decree echoed across the Soviet Union: Order number 227. It was more than just military strategy. It was a line drawn in blood: not one step back. No soldier was to retreat without orders. No commander was to abandon a position. Those who did faced court-martial or a bullet to the head. For the Red Army, it was a turning point, and for tens of thousands, it became a death sentence. Penal units were now official. The message was unmistakable. Redemption was possible, but only through sacrifice. Cowards would be turned into cannon fodder. Traitors would earn back trust by charging straight into machine gun fire. Order 227 didn't just create battalions, it created fear. It created barrier troops, men stationed behind their comrades with guns drawn, ordered to shoot anyone who dared turn back. This wasn't war. This was survival at the edge of madness, where every step forward meant leaving your soul behind. You didn't choose to join a penal unit. The war, or Stalin, chose for you. And once chosen, you were labeled one word: Strafnik. But not all Strafniki were the same. There were penal companies, smaller ragtag groups made up of common soldiers, low-ranking officers, and even prisoners from the Gulag: thieves, deserters, black marketeers. For some, it was a chance to escape execution. For others, it was a one-way ticket to hell. Then there were penal battalions, larger units composed entirely of disgraced officers. These were men who once led others into battle, now fighting to reclaim their ranks and their honor. Both groups shared one thing: they were expendable. Still, for many inmates of the Soviet prison system, joining a penal unit seemed like salvation, a chance to bleed and be forgiven, a shot at freedom, however slim. There was enthusiasm, one survivor recalled, even among prisoners. Because in Stalin's war, the choice was brutal but simple. Face the wall or face the enemy. And when you're marching toward death, redemption becomes the only thing worth dying for. No medals, no mercy, no return. For the penal units, war wasn't just dangerous, it was designed to be fatal. Strafniki were sent where others wouldn't dare, across open fields, into machine gun nests, through minefields with no detection gear, no artillery to soften the enemy, no armor to protect them, just rifles and orders. They were the first wave, always. Frontal assaults, suicide missions, rearguard defenses, decoys. They were the tools to break enemy lines or to break the enemy's will by sheer sacrifice. One commander wrote bitterly, "Our company survived 1, maybe 2 battles, rarely 3. No one lasted more than a month." Casualty rates in some units soared past 90%. Entire companies vanished within days. And yet, they kept going. Not out of loyalty, not out of hope, but because the only alternative was the bullet waiting behind them from their own side. To the Red Army, penal troops weren't soldiers, they were shields. To the front commanders, they were a grim equation, less blood from regulars, more from the condemned. In Stalin's war, redemption came in bodies, not in prayers. To lead a penal unit was not a reward, it was a sentence. Most commanders were horrified when assigned to Strafniki. They were expected to lead men who had been branded cowards, traitors, criminals, men no one trusted, especially not the regular army. These units were plagued by more than enemy bullets. Inside, they were shattered by mistrust, hatred, and despair. Civilians saw them as scum. Regular troops viewed them as expendable. Even the officers who led them were often disgusted or afraid. To keep order, Stalin's regime didn't rely on respect. They relied on surveillance. Attached to every penal unit were SMERSH agents, secret police with one job: to monitor, report, and execute if necessary. A whisper of disobedience, a single step back, and the punishment was swift and final. Some commanders used their Strafniki like cattle, forcing them through minefields, denying them rest, or treating them like living decoys. But not all were monsters. A few saw beyond the uniforms. They recognized that many of these men had simply made mistakes or been condemned by paranoia. And in rare moments of mercy, they tried to lead them, not just to survive, but to reclaim their humanity. In a war that devoured souls, that was perhaps the rarest victory of all. In front of them, German bullets. Behind them, Soviet bullets. This was the reality of many penal soldiers. Stalin didn't just send them into impossible battles. He made sure they had no way out. Behind the penal units stood a different kind of force. Barrier troops, also known as blocking detachments. Their job wasn't to fight the enemy, it was to ensure no one retreated. Formed from elite NKVD units, these men were ordered to shoot deserters, cowards, or anyone who broke ranks, even their own comrades. The logic was brutal. Fear of your own side had to be stronger than fear of the enemy. Penal soldiers were caught in a trap. Run forward and die. Stay still and die. Run backward and be executed. Memoirs describe it with chilling clarity. One soldier said, "We were fired upon from both directions. We didn't know who to fear more." These weren't isolated incidents. Entire operations were built on this system of terror. And yet, many veterans later said they never even saw barrier troops, proving that sometimes the idea of being watched was more powerful than the watchers themselves. Because in Stalin's war, obedience wasn't earned. It was forced, at gunpoint. You might think penal service was limited to the trenches, but Stalin's reach extended to the skies and seas. Strafniki weren't just in the Red Army. They were in the Navy, the Air Force, and everywhere else the motherland demanded blood. Sailors, mechanics, pilots, anyone who faltered could be stripped of rank and sent into the penal system. Some barely knew how to fire a rifle, yet were thrown into frontline combat with little more than hope and a bayonet. But even in the skies, redemption came with fire. One penal air unit, the 157th Fighter Aviation Regiment, was made up entirely of disgraced pilots. Their missions? The worst. Stalingrad, the Volga crossings, deep behind enemy lines, suicide flights. And yet, they performed brilliantly. In just 6 months, Strafniki pilots from that single unit shot down over 400 German aircraft. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and still deadly. But casualties were staggering. Few survived long enough to earn a second chance. These weren't just broken men. Many were still elite, still proud, still determined to fly, if only to rewrite their legacy before it was too late. Because in Stalin's war, the sky offered no refuge. Only one final dogfight between shame and salvation. There were only 3 ways out: die, get wounded, or become a hero. For most Strafniki, survival wasn't expected, but if you lived long enough or bled enough, you might earn your freedom. A serious wound guaranteed a full pardon. Even a minor injury could get you transferred back to a regular unit. That meant for many, the best hope was to get shot, just not fatally. Some soldiers mutilated themselves to escape, but if caught, immediate execution. Still, miracles happened. Entire penal units were sometimes pardoned after heroic missions. One battalion blew up German bridges deep behind enemy lines and made it back with minimal losses. The reward? Full reinstatement, a clean slate. But it all depended on your commander. Generals like Konstantin Rokossovsky granted pardons generously.
明天학나 하시 이때아또 메이나즈 스리 토코로마 하시 이때아또 간단틴노 도케단 미야그테 부소타니 토치와노 키모친나 토시니 그르마라데테 모토마데 코리아 부케 키무노 kakko jibuni po hashi iteyato.
Others, like Pavel Batov, were ruthless, pardoning only the man who fired the anti-tank gun, not the one who reloaded it. Only 3% of men completed their full penal terms and were released. Most were killed, wounded, or simply disappeared. And even when decorated for bravery, penal soldiers received fewer honors than regular troops. Their redemption was conditional, their past never fully erased. Because in Stalin's war, blood could buy forgiveness, but never forgetfulness. They were ghosts, sent to die, ordered to vanish, and yet they changed the course of the war. Over 1.5 million men passed through the Soviet penal units. Most left through blood, others through fire. Very few walked away. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, in Berlin, penal battalions were there, fighting, bleeding, winning. Not for glory, not for medals, but for a chance to be seen as human again. Some were heroes who made mistakes. Others were criminals who should never have worn a uniform. Together, they became the Red Army's shadow, its darkest truth and its desperate weapon. They were effective, some even brilliant, but they also left scars on history, on villages, on enemy prisoners. Because when you create soldiers from fear, from desperation, from punishment, you lose control of what you've built. Today, the Strafniki are rarely mentioned in Russian textbooks. There are few monuments, few names, few graves, but their legacy remains. In the silence of the fields they crossed, in the broken towns they helped liberate, in the war they helped win, though they were never meant to survive it. They weren't supposed to be remembered, but now you know who they were. History often remembers the victors, the heroes, the generals. But buried beneath the headlines are the shadows, men who were never meant to be remembered. The Soviet penal units were not symbols of glory. They were reminders of fear, brutality, and sacrifice. They fought not for recognition, but to survive, to return home, to wash the blood off their names. In telling their story, we don't seek to glorify what they endured, but to acknowledge it, because behind every forgotten grave, every silent battlefield lies a name, a face, a choice no one should ever have to make. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more untold chapters of history. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if faced with that choice? Until next time, remember, history is not just dates and battles, it's people. And sometimes, the ones we forget are the ones who paid the most.